Hello, everybody. A few days ago, the cover of the Sunday New York Times appeared with a remarkable essay by my guest today, The Devastating Legacy of Lies in Alzheimer's Science. The piece is having a great deal of impact. It's connected with a new book by my guest, Charles Piller, Doctored Fraud, Arrogance, and the Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's. It's one of the great investigative journalist books, certainly of the year and perhaps of the decade. And Charles Piller is joining us from just over the bay in Oakland, California. Charles, congratulations on the book. Tell us your background. I know you're a science writer. How did you come across what at least you call doctored this great scandal in terms of Alzheimer's research?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for having me on, Andrew. So I've been an investigative reporter on a lot of topics, but I tend to specialize in scientific and technical issues. And of course, I work now, have been for quite a few years with Science magazine. So I cover research, primarily biomedical research. And this story came to me initially through a tip, actually indirectly from a colleague of mine at Science. And it pertained to a particular Alzheimer's drug called Simufulum, made by a company called Cassava Sciences. And this is a drug that had a lot of high hopes, and it was heavily invested in and went through a bunch of clinical trials, but it was also dogged from a few years ago on by concerns by certain scientists that the fundamental studies behind it may have been based on some kind of digital manipulation of images that could amount to misconduct or perhaps even fraud. So one of the scientists who uncovered a lot of those concerns, a guy by the name of Matthew Schrag, who is a professor at Vanderbilt University, he and I hooked up indirectly, but eventually started talking. And of course, we talked extensively, and I ended up writing extensively about this issue of this drug Simufulum, which is, I might add, quite recently crashed and burned, and it is no longer being proposed or thought of as a possible remedy for Alzheimer's disease, as many people thought would be the case. But what was so interesting about our discussion is that it eventually evolved into an exploration of some of the thinking he was doing into whether this idea that image doctoring associated with the possibility that Simufulum-related doctoring had occurred applied more broadly to Alzheimer's disease. And Schrag, he's a neuroscientist, and this is his field. And of course, he's deeply concerned that if there was more than a one-off in this realm, he'd want to know about it and hope to perhaps try to set the record straight. So he was digging around, and he saw that there were some concerns raised about another scientist, a guy at the University of Minnesota by the name of Sylvain Lesne, and his mentor, an illustrious, important Alzheimer's scientist by the name of Karen Ash. And one of their experiments, which was one of the most influential in the history of the disease in the last 25 years or so, Schrag found that there was strong reasons to believe, strong evidence that it was based on doctored images that essentially undermined the experimental conclusions, which were extremely influential, published in the illustrious journal Nature. So that was the beginning of all this for me, and it set me on a path of looking more broadly at the field. That story that I wrote in Science about his findings did have a lot of interest. It generated a lot of interest in the field, and also more broadly, it was written about globally by
it was entitled Brain Games.
Actually, it was before that, Andrew. It was a story called Blots on a Field, and it was back in 2022. So I've been at this for a few years now. This story, Blots on a Field, concerned this one study in Nature and some related research by both Karen Ash and Lesney, the two principal scientists involved with the ideas associated with that were so influential and so important to bolstering confidence in the primary dominant hypothesis about Alzheimer's disease.
Charles, this is chilling on so many fronts. I want to get into the more granular details in a second, but Alzheimer's is something that we hear about more and more. I know that some people believe that it will grow into a $1 trillion crisis by 2050. What is it about Alzheimer's disease that make it so symbolic of perhaps both the challenges and opportunities in healthcare in the first part of the 21st century?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I've pondered myself, but I would say there's a couple aspects of it that I think set it apart from other diseases. One is that it is, for many people, perhaps most people, chilling, terrifying, beyond a lot of other ailments, partly because it is a disease. As it progresses, it steals not just our memories and our ability to function in everyday life, but even the sense of self that we have that makes us fully human. And as a result, it's not just a burden on the individuals who are stricken with Alzheimer's, but on their loved ones and on the healthcare system as a whole. But I think probably a pretty important point that is a subtext of all of it is that unlike other diseases that are gigantically important, in particularly diseases of aging, but more generally heart disease and cancer, for example, which are the two biggest killers in our country. These are diseases that have been dramatically, there's been dramatic progress associated with those. There have been a variety of remedies, things like chemotherapy, radiation, genetic therapy, even healthful habits that have greatly improved the lives of people who have been stricken with these diseases and sometimes cured them. Nothing like that is true of Alzheimer's disease. It is a gigantic population of people for which there is no remedy that arrests the disease, the progression, the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's, let alone reverses it. And so it's really among the major killers. It's almost in its own class as a terrible disease.
And I think everybody knows someone, parent, relative, friend, who has been touched by this. Who was Alzheimer's? Why is it called Alzheimer's? And when was it named as a disease?
Sure. Elwa Alzheimer, German scientists, made the seminal breakthrough in defining Alzheimer's disease in 1906. And at the time, he was a pathologist doing autopsies, but also a clinician. And he followed a particular patient who exhibited what we now know are the classic symptoms of dementia. And what Alzheimer found in his autopsy was this patient had two really obvious characteristics in her brain. One was these so-called sticky plaques that people may be familiar with that term. These are a particular kind of protein called amyloid beta protein that accumulates in the brain. And the second is something called tau proteins. These are the so-called tangles that occur within brain cells. These combination of factors plus the symptoms of dementia characterized, as Alzheimer put it, this disease, Alzheimer's disease, that was named after him some years later. Now, what I want to say, though, about Alzheimer's disease that I think is very important for people to understand is that many decades went by and there wasn't a lot of attention placed on this disease, really for purely demographic reasons. And that's because so few people were living to the classic age when Alzheimer's becomes more prevalent. Nowadays, we have much longer lives. And because the population of elders in our communities has grown vastly in the last few decades and is particularly high now, as a result, you have a situation where many, many, many more people are getting Alzheimer's disease. So it wasn't really until the 70s and 80s that people began to focus millions, even ultimately billions of dollars in focusing on the disease.
Yeah, so in a way, won't say it's good news, but it is a consequence of better healthcare more broadly. Can one be young, Charles, and get Alzheimer's, or is it inevitably a consequence of aging?
Sure. You can get Alzheimer's, what they call early onset Alzheimer's, between usually the ages of as young as 30 and maybe up to 65. After 65, they consider it more conventional Alzheimer's, although it's usually a disease of people even far older than 65. And that is sometimes due to genetic predispositions and probably some factors that scientists will still take quite a while to kind of work out.
So you began to investigate this. I mean, there's the specific investigation, but there's also a broader context of the issue of American healthcare and for-profit drug companies and all the research. What does this story tell us about that?
Well, I think one of the big picture takeaways for me from years of research on this is that there has been a situation where, although we have stellar institutions of science in our country, and in my view, none better in the world, I'm talking about the funders like the National Institutes of Health, the regulators like FDA, and universities and scholarly journals. Even though I've written quite critically of all of these institutions in my book and in articles over the years, I have great respect for many of the people that work in them. And I think that their work has been serving the public in incredibly valuable ways, and they deserve a lot of support. That said, my view is that they've failed terribly in a couple of key areas that are central to the thesis of my book, which concerns misconduct in biomedical research. And what I've found is that universities, the federal funders, the federal regulators like FDA, and the scholarly journals have all been basically asleep at the wheel when it comes to examining the possibility that scholars, even leading scholars in the field, not just Alzheimer's, but other fields as well, in examining whether they have been engaging in image doctoring that can be a form of fraud in their field, and therefore skewing the thinking of the field in serious ways that is harmful to patients and harmful to scientific thinking and moving progress in things like Alzheimer's disease more rapidly.
Yeah, and it reflects so badly your story on the scientific community. So when the populists go after science or the scientific community, it bolsters their position. The subtitle of your book, Charles, is Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest to Cure Alzheimer's. There's always going to be arrogance, I think, especially when it comes to senior researchers in science. The tragic element is something perhaps we will come to. But what about the fraud? Is this, in your view, in terms of the narrative in your book, is this a kind of criminal enterprise of researchers or companies who are simply trying to cook the books to make money?
Yes, I think there's an element of that, but I don't think that's the major factor. So when I say I think there's an element of that, I think it would be interesting for people to call their attention to, again, this example I used earlier. I think it's an archetypal example, which is this company called Cassava Sciences and a close collaborator of theirs. The collaborator, a guy by the name of Huyan Wang, who is, I should say, a professor at CUNY, City University of New York, was indicted for fraud by the U.S. Department of Justice last year for experiments associated with his work for this company and their drug, their Alzheimer's drug. The a couple of top executives of their company were forced out in a settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission because of allegations of fraud associated with securities laws involving the share price of the company and related issues. And the company was forced to pay $40 million to SEC to settle that case. That's an egregious example. And then, of course, their drug as I mentioned earlier, it failed in clinical trials. So there clearly are cases where the possibility of real fraud seemingly associated with financial gain can take place. However, I would say that most of the motivation going into this has to do with the imperatives of success in the academic environment. We live in an academic world where it's publish or perish. That's a cliche, but it's very true in today's world. And what it means is that people who are desperately competitive, as they must be in order to succeed and excel in the field of Alzheimer's research and many other scientific fields, sometimes become willing to cut corners. If you will, I don't know what goes on, obviously, in each individual's minds about this, but I have a framework that I've formulated after looking at these cases one after the other for years that I think holds some water, which is that people who begin often with what they call beautifying their images in their scientific work, and these could be micrographs, which are heavily magnified images of things like brain tissue, and they could be something called Western blots, which are a test that is used to measure and display proteins within a tissue sample like brain tissue or even in blood. And these images can be modified in a way that is thought of as so-called beautification. In other words, not altering the fundamental findings of an experiment, but making them look better, giving them, if you will, a little curb appeal for publishers in the scientific journal industry, which they might often need in order to be published, particularly in leading journals. They want their stuff to look as good as it can be.
So the way you're presenting it, Charles, this is not Theranos 2.0 or Enron. This is, for the most part, doctors playing the system, trying to promote themselves, giving themselves the benefit of the doubt for their own career self-promotion. Is that fair, broadly?
I would say that's a lot of it, but I would say it goes far beyond that, and including in the examples I describe in the book, which include detailed analysis of 46 significant researchers in Alzheimer's disease and hundreds of papers that they wrote. Some of the evidence here is so distinct, it's so patterned, it's so methodical that changes were deliberately made that changed the underlying findings of an experiment, that the so-called beautification argument really doesn't apply.
Have the feds got involved here? I mean, I assume your book, which is just out, has been looked at carefully by the lawyers of your publisher. I don't know whether you've been called by some of the people you write about, but are there criminal investigations into what happened?
Well, there were multiple investigations into Cassava Sciences, as I mentioned earlier, by the Department of Justice and also the Securities and Exchange Commission. And let me make it clear that the information that I work on and the dossiers that were prepared in preparation for me to write about them through a collaboration with these forensic image sleuths, these experts in forensic image analysis with whom I worked, these were sent to the federal agencies that are responsible for these matters, the National Institutes of Health primarily, because they fund a lot of this work. And so they're well aware of it. This is part of what's disappointing about the performance of these agencies that, again, I personally think have done great good in the world. But in this case, they have been very complacent in understanding the degree of harm that can come from flagrant and widespread falsification of research that taints the understanding of this disease in the entire pool of Alzheimer's knowledge.
Lots of politicization these days, Charles. You don't need me to tell you this, of the medical establishment. I think Trump just dropped federal protection for Anthony Fauci, lots of suggestions, particularly within the MAGA movement, that the scientific establishment has its own agenda. Do you think books like yours will only fan the flames of that paranoia about the scientific establishment?
Well, believe me, Andrew, this is something that I've pondered long and hard. And what I've had to come to the conclusion of is that the scientific establishment needs to be shaken out of their lethargy about the importance of misconduct in their ranks. And it's for the good of advancing the science and protecting patients. And my view is that they have an opportunity to do that proactively and to make reforms and to, I think, quite importantly, reinvigorate their somewhat too relaxed systems for investigating and correcting the possibility of misconduct or even fraud in scientists that are funded by federal agencies. Until they begin to do that, they run the risk of someone, and I would say anti-science forces within the MAGA movement and possibly within the Trump administration directly, taking action that would be deleterious to the long-term health and benefit of the research establishment and also patients and doctors' ability to help people. So, yes, I think it's terrible that there may be criticism that is harmful of the agencies, but really it's something in their lap. They need to take better action and to reform their practices.
You haven't mentioned names, Charles. You're too polite for that, but I will, of course. JFK Jr., who is Trump's nominee. I don't think he's been passed yet. Maybe he will. He's a very controversial figure on vaccines and raw milk and many other things. He's been very critical of the healthcare establishment, and even some progressives seem sympathetic in part. Is RFK onto something? Is he right in some of his criticisms, and are those criticisms borne out in your book, Doctored?
Well, my book really doesn't touch directly on a lot of his criticisms, but let me say that I disagree with RFK Jr. on many things. And as a result, it's concerning to me some of the proposals he might bring to the fore if he is confirmed. That said, there are certain things in the institutional authorities of science that he's right to be skeptical of. I think we owe it to ourselves as citizens and consumers of medicine and of healthcare to retain some skepticism. It doesn't mean that we should disbelieve doctors and scientists. I think that the vast majority of doctors and scientists, particularly scientists who work in areas of great concern, including Alzheimer's research, are completely honest people who are deeply committed to solving the problems of that disease. I am not meaning to imply or suggest in any way that the entire scientific enterprise is riddled with fraud and misconduct. I think it's a minority, just like it is in any other walk of life. That said, it's been particularly harmful in Alzheimer's disease because of the difficulty of this disease to cure. It's just a tremendously hard problem that has been, I think, made further difficult. It's been more difficult to solve because of people being steered in the wrong direction because of misdirection caused sometimes by misconduct in the field.
Yeah, I'm guessing people perhaps most outraged by your new book, Doctored, would be the honest researchers within the medical establishment. What are the long-term implications in terms of research on Alzheimer's that you uncover in Doctored? Did the entire profession take a wrong fork in the road because of this, or is the damage relatively easy to clean up?
Well, I would say that there's both huge problems going forward and some hope, but let me start with the problems. The Alzheimer's field of research has been dominated by this one hypothesis called the amyloid hypothesis for many years, and it's concerning the proteins that I mentioned earlier, the amyloid beta proteins that are thought to start a cascade of biomedical effects in the brain that lead to Alzheimer's dementia. And because this hypothesis has been so dominant, it has received the vast majority of scientific mind share, you might say, as well as funding and emphasis in thinking and in training and in the whole discourse about the field, and in drug company investment in trying to develop new drugs, which is a vastly expensive enterprise.
Mm.
Because of all that, other ideas about Alzheimer's, other ways of thinking about the disease that could be fruitful if explored more fully, have been starved for funds. They've been starved for mind share in the field and have progressed very much more slowly than otherwise they might have been. Now that said, I don't want to make it seem like it's hopeless. Of course, even though the amyloid hypothesis, which in my view has not been successful in solving this problem and doesn't show immediate signs of success in years to come, despite that, there are other ideas that are starting to come to the fore that I think could prove fruitful and at least deserve much closer look. And one of them, interestingly, has to do with the GLP-1 inhibitors. These are the basis of these new dramatic, important weight loss drugs like Wegovy and others. And these drugs are now being tested for their possible benefits in improving or at least slowing decline in Alzheimer's disease patients. And they look promising and interesting. And I think by sometime next year, we're going to have a much clearer idea about whether they could also be beneficial for Alzheimer's as they are for things like obesity. The second area that I think is of great interest to me is an increasingly close look at the possibility that Alzheimer's might be related to, associated with infections. And for example, latent infections with herpes virus, which can cause immediate lesions, cold sores, things like that, that go away. They might hang out in other organs like the brain for years, even decades. And so there are some really interesting experiments going on, including clinical trials, to see whether attacking these latent viruses might have a bearing on improving or slowing cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients. So that's another area that I'm keenly interested in.
Very interesting. What about Schrage? You've mentioned him. He was the person who put you onto this scandal, this scam. Did he take significant risks? If your book's ever turned into a movie, I'm guessing he'll be the hero. Tell us about him and why he took the risk, because I'm guessing others knew about it but weren't willing to call you or notify you.
Yeah, I would say others did know about this problem. I think Schrage is a courageous guy, and whistleblowers like him often and their careers end badly as a result of being.
Yeah, I mean, he's currently at Vanderbilt, is that right?
That's right. He's a professor at Vanderbilt, and at the time we started talking, and at the time he ended up taking a gigantic role in exposing widespread apparent misconduct and image doctoring in the field. Schrage was not even tenured. He was a junior professor getting his lab going. The risk for him were multiple. One is that he was in a position then of possibly openly criticizing the agency that he needed money from to keep his lights on. That's NIH. He was openly criticizing the most important scholarly journals that he needed to publish in so that he could advance his career, and also leading figures in his field. So this is not something one takes on lightly. And he and I spent months talking about his situation, the risks he was running, and whether he wanted to be named in my initial article and subsequently. And Schrage ultimately decided that he understood. And of course, I wanted him to be named because I wanted to tell this whole tale as a narrative, as not just a dry scientific exposition of issues, but as a human story of what happens when someone tries to explore the hidden corners of the field. And I take it from the perspective of not just Schrage, but people who took other roles in this story, including roles that were
Charles, can you see and hear me? Oh, fucking hell. Mm. Yeah. Oh, hi, Charles. Did you get cut off?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm sorry to say it, this has never happened to me before.
Okay, well, just try and come back in. Don't worry.
Well, I lost my network here. I lost my Wi-Fi network. There must be a system failure for the provider.
Oh, my God. Okay.
It's crazy. I just literally, oh, wait, it's back.
Okay, we'll come back in then.
Okay.
Thanks. Hi, Charles. Can you see me?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm terribly sorry about that.
Don't worry, it's not your fault. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you another. So I'll edit this. Charles, Matthew Schrag clearly took a lot of risks. Was he ever threatened? Did he get phone calls in the middle of the night? Did anyone suggest that if he spilt the beans, he would be punished in some way?
Only online. I'm pleased to be able to say he was not personally threatened in that way. Obviously, he did this in an incredibly careful way. Anyone can sue for anything, anyone can threaten for anything, but both he and I went about this process in a way that was meant to be as bulletproof as possible.
As real scientists, you were doing the scientific method in terms of uncovering this fraud.
Absolutely. And I might add that part of how I have this commitment to my own journalism, but also my commitment to Schrag and others as a source is that I vet their work with great care, not just ensuring that their analysis of images is regarded as correct, well-constructed, and believable by other forensic image analysts. I did that, but I also sent these findings to several of the leading experts in Alzheimer's disease in the world in order to get their sense of the meaningfulness of the information. Because it's one thing to have doctored images in studies. It's another thing for them to be important or influential. And I needed to understand whether both factors were at play. In doing so, I also helped to indemnify Schrag from claims that perhaps what he was doing was somehow a personal attack on other scientists.
Finally, Charles, you mentioned earlier that there are some encouraging signs on Alzheimer's in terms of the research. Many people are concerned with this. You often read stories in the papers about how to avert it, exercise, food, social activity, the standard responses. Do you have any sense on that? Are there lifestyle choices we can make which might avert Alzheimer's, or is that the wrong way of thinking about it?
No, I actually think that's an excellent way of thinking about it, but you have to keep it within proportion. People should understand that they have agency in this. And what I mean by that is healthful habits, watching your blood pressure and cholesterol levels, ensuring that you are getting the exercise you need and eating a good diet. These are not solutions to the Alzheimer's problem, but it's well known that these kinds of actions can sometimes forestall the worst effects of dementia. And people owe it to themselves to use these kinds of activities and healthful habits, not just for Alzheimer's disease, but more generally for their health. And I think when people say that there's some kind of panacea or additives or nutritional supplements that can cure Alzheimer's or prevent it, I haven't studied that carefully, but the experts with whom I speak don't give a lot of credence to that. But what we know is that there are ways to try to be a player in surviving in your own life, including helping your own cognition, holding at bay the worst effects of the disease.
Yeah, and the subtitle of the book is about the quest to cure Alzheimer's. We talked about the growing cost of Alzheimer's by the middle of the 21st century. People often talk about a cure for cancer. One wonders whether that's real. Is it conceivable in the next 75 years, Charles, that there may be a cure to Alzheimer's, or is it just going to be a condition that we as a species will have to live with? Hopefully live with rather than die with.
Yeah, well, I think 75 years is a long time. I'm quite sure that there will be much better remedies on the horizon for Alzheimer's. I think even within the next 10 to 20 years, there's so assuming that these new ideas are supported, funded, and are able to capture some of the attention of the scientific community so that they can be developed more broadly. So yes, I think experimentation, diversity of thinking, it's gonna help cure this disease eventually.
Well, Charles Piller, congratulations on your new book. It's a very controversial subject: fraud, doctored fraud, arrogance, and the tragedy and the quest to cure Alzheimer's. It's one of the more important books about science and scientific fraud this year. Congratulations. And I hope it won't be 75 years, Charles, till we get you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. It's been great talking to you. I appreciate it.